It was a pretty good sermon that Paul gave on that part of that letter that he wrote, wasn't it? Sounds like life, the Christian life. And I think this story about Jesus and his disciples in the boat is the next place to go with that. Today's Bible story does take place at the end of a long, full day of ministry. Maybe you can relate to a day like that, whether it was in the church or somewhere else where you were engaged in God's work. And it's a day where Jesus has been teaching a crowd of people by the lake, often says that, by the lake, and using a lot of parables that he likes to use, and he can't get a minute's rest because the disciples are always calling him aside saying, "What did that mean?" And so it's very, very busy for him. And as this scene opens now, it's nighttime. It's the end of that day, and it's going to get dark. And Jesus is saying, we're going to go over to the other side of the lake and work first thing in the morning, which means overnight travel. And so let's listen to what happens during the night crossing across the Sea of Galilee. We're in Mark chapter 4, verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let's go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. Other boats were with them. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, and the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and they said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind. And he said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe, and they said to one another, "Who is this then, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I guess it stands to reason that night is not a great time to cross the Sea of Galilee. And the first thing I noticed here is that Jesus trusted his disciples to pilot the boat and just let them go ahead and do it and didn't interfere and didn't supervise. And then I thought, well, God does do that a lot. Asks us to do things and trusts us to do them. And so that's what he did. And then just like that, a storm comes out of nowhere. And it threatens the little boat carrying the precious people. You would say Jesus is pretty precious, and the disciples are pretty important and to this whole good news thing. And the boat is rocking, and the wind is blowing, and the waves are crashing over the boat. And it says it was already beginning to swamp the boat, meaning I guess that it was like 1 minute it started, and the next minute it was already beginning to swamp the boat. Now, Mark says there are other boats going there across the lake too, and so we'll return to that in a little bit. And everyone seems to be scared to death in this boat with Jesus. Well, not everyone. I guess for centuries, people have been amazed that Jesus is asleep. The back of the boat, interesting detail, with his head on a cushion. It's like planning to get some good sleep. He's not just accidentally drifting off. Everyone's expecting disaster. Jesus is completely asleep. And now in the Bible, good sleep is connected with trusting God. I have a favorite verse from Psalm 4:8 that says, "I will both lie down and sleep in peace. For you alone, O Lord, make me lie down in safety." So watching the others freaking out and watching Jesus sleeping, I say to myself, wow, that's what it looks like when you completely trust God, the Creator, the Father of all. That's what that looks like. And that's what it looks like to have faith. But right now, the disciples need to wake him up because they're not there. That's not where they are in their faith. And they call out to him over the sound of the storm, and they say, "Don't you care what's happening? Don't you know? Don't you care that we're going to die?" And he wakes up. I'd love to see what he looked like or what his expression was, whether he was kind of like smiling a little bit maybe, or not taking on their stress probably, and just says, "Peace, be still." And it's like bathwater. It's calm. It's like that kind of lake or ocean where nothing's going on. It's just beautiful, like a mirror. And then the Lord speaks to them again, these disciples whom he has called for a purpose, and he says, "Why were you afraid? Don't you have faith yet?" And if they did answer, it's not recorded. It's fascinating that what is recorded, and there's 3 versions of this, they're very similar, is that they are in awe. They're like in worship. They're like in wonder. Like, who is this that can do this? They're excited. So although I want to talk about faith today, and I'm definitely going there, and we already have by reading this, I want to start with fear. Because it's not always the storm itself, but the fear that can threaten to hurt us, I believe. The storm at the sea, of course, makes the disciples afraid, and we are made to be afraid of things that we need to stop doing or run away from, and our heart beats fast and the adrenaline gets going, and there's biology at work, and they do what they can to avoid danger. I imagine they're using what they can to try to get the water out. It's not working, and their fear gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And as fear does, watch this, it has them predicting what's going to happen. So it has them like looking ahead. We're going to die. And doesn't make them feel any better to see him sleeping or to see him resting. It's not like looking at the stewardess when the airplane's bumpy and they're sitting there, looking at their texts, and you're like, okay. It doesn't help. They're incredulous, and now they're afraid he doesn't even care. So apparently, when he challenges their fear and says, "Why were you afraid?" they are speechless. One of our favorite vacations in the last few years has been to the province of Prince Edward Island, which is in the Maritime provinces over there by Nova Scotia and so forth. And it's laid back and beautiful, and all kinds of things stand out. One is mussels, if you've been there. And by the way, most of our mussels come from PEI. Look in the grocery store. French fries, a lot of potatoes come from there. Anne of Green Gables, and lighthouses. So there's 63 lighthouses in Prince Edward Island. Some of them are open to climb up in. Not me, Chuck does that. And some have museums. And I remember we went to one of the museums, and there was a big map on the wall as big as probably maybe most of that rectangle up there. And it showed the shipwrecks that had happened around Prince Edward Island, PEI, and the size of the boat and how many people perished. And it was from the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century. It was crazy how dangerous it is to fish and do business out on the water, and really drove that point home. And so the Sea of Galilee was known for its danger in storms. It is a maritime place. It's a place with fishing and other maritime activities, and I guess you could go out at night, but storms could always come, and everyone knew that. And so, having been fishermen by trade, 4 of them, I'm sure that obviously they're afraid because people have perished in storms like this. So Jesus knew that, and I'm thinking his question was meant to go deeper. That's not really like on the surface, why were you afraid? This story was told in a similar way in 3 of the Gospels, quickly circulated through the early church. And I heard a video, a commentary lately that said the martyrs of the early church knew this story and could have peace during that time. And it's been translated into more than 2,000 languages, like the rest of the New Testament. It's for people who have never been on the Sea of Galilee, who have never even been in a boat, and yet they understand, because we all have storms. And in every context and every kind of storm in this story, God is saying, do not fear. Maybe he's saying more to us, peace, be still. So the question, why did you fear, is not naive. Fear is normal. Life is not storm-free. Life is not stress-free. We know fear very well. It's an acquaintance. I'd say it's not a friend, but it's definitely an acquaintance. We know. We know it steals joy. We know that it stops us from doing things that we should do, even like fun things, because we're afraid. It can whisper, you can't do that. You're not capable of that. You're not good enough. Fear can tell you not to break up with someone you should not see anymore, not to leave an unhealthy job, because the unknown, you don't even know what could happen if you did that. But God says clearly we don't need to be afraid. We don't need to be afraid. Jesus says, turn that fear over to me and I'll give you my peace. In his beautiful book, Meditations of the Heart, Howard Thurman, who was a pastor to Martin Luther King, prolific writer, beautiful writer, he wrote how there's a lot of room inside of us for chaos. There's a lot of room inside of us for fear. Like, how about making some room for peace? How about making some room for Christ? He writes, peace of mind that inspires the singleness of purpose Christ gives us, peace of heart that quiets all fears, peace of spirit that filters through all confusion and takes away their power. It says in Ephesians, Jesus is our peace. Jesus is the Prince of Peace, and he's the source of abundant life. But you know what? There's another thing here, is that he didn't avoid storms, so it gets kind of complicated. This sermon's about peace in the storm. This sermon is not about you need to go off and pray and have a spa day. This is about peace in the storms, finding peace there. So in Jesus' work and in his life, he encountered storms all the time. You've read about them, you know about them. People didn't understand what he was saying. They didn't agree. They were afraid of him. And he moved through his human fear, and he found peace because of his faith. A German pastor once said in a sermon on this passage that when you are afraid, to name the one who nailed fear to the cross. He said, name the one who overcame fear and nailed it to the cross and redeemed us from all fear, even the fear of death. That pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who preached this sermon from a pulpit in 1933, 10 years before he was died in a German camp, he said, Jesus alone is Lord over fear. Fear knows Jesus as its master, and it gives away to him alone. He wrote, so look to Jesus when you're afraid. Think of Christ. Call on Christ like these disciples did. Help! Call on Christ and pray to him and believe that he's with you now, helping you. He said, you can easily imagine fear being in the boat. And when fear is in the boat, you can imagine all the dangers and all the things that could happen. And you know how easy, I'm going to say, it is to pass that fear on to the other people in the room, in your family, in your community, and politically. So when you think of Christ, it's like the heavens open up and the fear is pushed out of the boat. Peace, be still. When I'm reflecting and praying on a particular sermon, I'll sermon text all week, and I always am carrying it around like it's like in my backpack and my purse and my heart. It's always there. I kind of live it, and that happened this week. So after my cancer treatments last year, I have a schedule of scans every 6 months, and this week was one of those times. And I can't tell a lie in church. I get afraid when you get to about the second or third week out from that. I start getting afraid. And it crawls up in my heart, and it starts taking up that space that Howard Thurman's talking about. And you know how your mind, again, gets busy and you start playing out, well, if it's bad, then it'll be all right, but then we'll have to do this, and this will happen. And you can get pretty creative in that. So I did that a little bit. But faith was also there and would not leave me, because I had this scripture in my pocket. And also I remembered that when I was in a big storm, my caregiver and I, Chuck and I, when we were in big trouble with this rare cancer, that we had storms and we prayed and Christ was with us. And sometimes I cried out like, oh, don't you care? But my faith grew. So when I was waiting this week, I would literally say, Jesus is in the boat. Like in my head, I'd say it out loud. Jesus is in the boat. And so even though nothing else changed, and I did that a lot of times, by the way, not just once, even though a lot of things didn't change, a lot of things did change. And that was that I did get a peace about, just a peace, a joy, like an okayness. Well, the news turned out to be good. Sorry for the delay, but I had to have a delay to tell you the story. It did turn out to be good. No sign of cancer. See you in 6 months. Yay, that's great. But that wasn't the only time I said Jesus is in the boat this past week. It's a wonderful affirmation of faith all the time. I said it when I was driving a few days ago. There were sheets of rain on 295. I couldn't see very well. I said, Jesus is in the boat. It's kind of like Jesus take the wheel, but maybe more safe. I said it when I had a conversation with a person over the phone, and they said something that kind of hurt me, and instead of like spinning out, what if, or I'm going to tell them, or I just said, Jesus is in the boat. And you know what? There was peace. And I said it when I was praying for others at the service yesterday, others who have lost loved ones, others who are in terrible situations. I said, Jesus is in the boat. He's in their boat. He's in the boat. And I heard Jesus say, peace, be still. So as I close, I want to go back to that little verse at the beginning that Mark includes. Other boats were with them. Remember that? What happened to those people? Well, you know, they were on the sea that night, and I doubt the storm was just right there over that one boat. And their boats probably tossed and turned, and they were probably scared to death. And they also had a great calm when Jesus said, peace, be still. And so I wondered, since I so often pray for what I hear in the news, and there's a lot of storms going on, not just literal. I wondered, isn't it a perfect prayer to pray, Jesus is in the boat, for everything, for all that, for those storms? And might we hear Jesus be saying, not just in our minds, but all over the world, peace, be still? Might that be happening? I was so moved by the end of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's sermon in this increasingly ominous time of the 1930s in Germany. He said in his sermon on this passage at the end, he said, faith does not rely on itself. It's kind of like the passage Chuck read. Faith does not rely on itself or favorable seas or favorable circumstances. It doesn't rely on its own strength or other people's strength, but believes only and alone in God, whether or not there's a storm. He said, we can always call on Christ. Lord, save us. We are perishing. Having faith in the midst of fear because we know where our help comes from. He said, for we say with amazement, like those first disciples, what sort of man is this, that even the sea and the winds obey him? He said, who is in the boat? It's God. And to God be the glory. Amen. Amen.